My name is Cara O'Sullivan, and I serve the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry as Assistant Director of Continuing Education. It's great to see all of you here tonight for our first lecture of our Fall 2023 Continuing Education Lecture Series. Thank you for coming. It's so nice to be able to gather with you in person and with our online audience via live stream. Special thanks to the Boston College Theology Department for co-sponsoring tonight's lecture. As part of the school's mission, we offer an array of enrichment opportunities to foster Christian faith and promote lifelong learning. We do this with on-campus presentations like this one, as well as online courses, webinars, videos, and other resources for personal enrichment and professional development. Our next several STM online Crossroads courses start next week on October 4th. The courses include Autumn Blessings, which examines the spiritual tasks in the second half of adulthood in contrast to the first half of life, and Ignatian Spirituality, which explores the pillars of Ignatian spirituality, including the spiritual exercises, prayer, contemplation, the examen, and discernment. More information on these and all of our courses is available by visiting bc.edu/crossroads. Don't miss your opportunity to enroll. Our fall calendar of lectures is detailed in this flyer, which is available at the entrance, as well as visiting our website at bc.edu/reg. bc.edu/stmreg. We have a number of upcoming lectures, and I will just briefly highlight the next two. Next Thursday, October 5th, Fordham University's Professor Brenna Moore will join us for Spiritual Friendship, Modern Catholic Reflections on a Universal Theme. And on Thursday, October 12th, STM's own Professor Hosman Ospino will join us for No Synodal Church Without Catechetical Reform. More information on all of our upcoming opportunities is available at the entrance to this room. We hope you can join us for a future event or enroll in a course. Thanks to Father Keenan for granting us permission to record tonight's presentation, including the Q&A portion. We're so grateful for the opportunity to extend the life of this lecture. Within about 1 month, you will be able to find this video posted in our Encore archive at bc.edu/encore. Bookmarks with this web address are available at the entrance to this room. Speaking of bookmarks, please be sure to visit the BC Bookstore table at the entrance to this room. The BC Bookstore has Father Keenan's most recent book, A History of Catholic Theological Ethics, available for sale, and we also have information for sales of the book for our online audience. As mentioned earlier, during the Q&A program, there'll be an opportunity for conversation and Q&A, and there are just 2 points to keep in mind. First, before you ask a question, please wait for the microphone so the video can pick it up. And second, please know that if you do ask a question, it will likely be part of the final video and may have a long shelf life. So just be sure you're okay with asking a question and keep that in mind. For those of us joining online, please post your questions using the Q&A feature at the bottom of the screen at any time during the presentation. My colleague James will be able to share your questions during the Q&A portion of this evening's event. We'll aim to answer as many questions as possible. Finally, for those joining us virtually, we're also able to offer live closed captioning for this presentation. Please click on the closed captioning button at the bottom of your screen to enable or disable this feature. Many thanks to Thais and Isabella, graduate students here at the STM, for providing the closed captioning support for us today. Now I invite my colleague Megan DeDios, Director of Continuing Education here at the Boston College School of Theology and Ministry, to introduce our speaker. Megan.
Hello, everyone, and welcome. We're so delighted to have you here for Pathways to Holiness, Early Christianity and Ethics. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker. James F. Keenan, S.J., is the Canisius Chair, Director of the Jesuit Institute, and Vice Provost of Global Engagement at Boston College. He received a BA from Fordham University and an MDiv from the Weston School of Theology. A Jesuit priest since 1982, he received a licentiate and a doctorate from the Pontifical Gregorian University in Rome. Father Keenan has been a full-time professor in the Boston College Theology Department since 2005. In 2003, he founded Catholic Theological Ethics in the World Church, an international network of ethicists, and subsequently hosted 3 international and 6 regional conferences. Today, the network is comprised of over 1,000 Catholic ethicists and has its own book series. Father Keenan has published over 400 essays, articles, and reviews worldwide. He has edited or written over 25 books, including University Ethics, How Colleges Can Build and Benefit from a Culture of Ethics, and most recently, A History of Catholic Theological Ethics, which again is available for purchase at the front of the room. His forthcoming book, Preparing for the Moral Life, the Martin Darcy Memorial Lectures, will be published by Georgetown University Press later this year. In 2019, he received the John Courtney Murray Lifetime Achievement Award from the Society of Christian Ethics. From 2020 to 2021, he served as president of the Society of Christian Ethics. We are honored to have such a distinguished scholar and colleague open our fall continuing education series. Welcome, Father Keenan.
Thank you all for coming, and thank you to Tara and to Megan for putting this together and keeping me in line. I'm delighted to be here. I'm basically presenting to you the second chapter of my 8-chapter work on the history of Catholic theological ethics. But I think that the second chapter is the key to the book. So, yeah, let's see what you think. So I'll be about 42 minutes, and then we have a question for you to engage with among yourselves, and then to hear your questions in return. So, my thesis: the moral tradition developed from its inception pathways to holiness, embodied pathways that were collective, merciful, hospitable, exemplary, and grace-filled. I'll read that again, but it's my thesis. The moral tradition developed from its inception pathways to holiness, embodied pathways that were collective, merciful, hospitable, exemplary, and grace-filled. My mentor, the Jesuit Joseph Fuchs, noted that innovation marked the agenda of most Roman Catholic moral theology from the 1940s through to the end of the 20th century. The innovation was, for the most part, to take moral theology out of the isolating framework of the moral manuals in which it functioned from the end of the 16th century to the middle of the 20th century. These manuals were an attempt to outline what actions were sinful or evil. The manuals, as they were called, distinguished themselves from those writing about pursuing the good. Those authors wrote about growing in perfection, or the ascetical life, or the spiritual life. In a manner of speaking, from the 16th to the 20th centuries, moral theologians and these ascetical theologians split the first principle of the natural law, which is to avoid evil and to pursue the good. They split it into two. In the church, minimally, all Catholics were called simply to avoid evil, to be saved. The pursuit of the good was optional. It was for those who wanted the ascetical or spiritual life. This is the way the church operated for the last 4 centuries. Before that, that was not the case. That's my argument. We see this singular emphasis on the moral life as exclusively being about avoiding sin in the first Roman Catholic moral manual in English that appeared in 1908. So at the beginning of the 20th century, all the moral manuals appeared in the vernacular. The Germans, the French, the Italians, Portuguese, they all published theirs in the vernacular. And the first one in English was by the English Jesuit Thomas Slater, a manual of moral theology that he wrote in 1908. In its preface, Slater acknowledges that moral theology's exclusive preoccupation is with sin. By focusing on sin, he affirms that there is no need for moral theology to engage the ascetical or spiritual life. He writes, this is a long quote from his preface, but it's really remarkable for what he says. Moral theology is the product of centuries of labor bestowed by able and holy men on the practical problems of Christian ethics. Here, however, we must ask the reader to bear in mind that the manuals of moral theology are technical works intended to help the confessor and the parish priest in the discharge of their duties. They are as technical as the textbooks of the lawyer and the doctor. They are not intended for edification, nor do they hold up a high ideal of Christian perfection for the imitation of the faithful. They deal with what is of obligation under pain of sin. They are books of moral pathology. They are necessary for the Catholic priest to enable him to administer the sacrament of penance and to fulfill other duties. Slater notes the very abundant literature of ascetical theology, but adds that moral theology proposes to itself the much humbler but still necessary task of defining what is right and what is wrong in all the practical relations of the Christian life. He concludes, the first step on the right road of conduct is to avoid evil. From the 1930s through the 1960s, so 25 years forward, several reforming theologians attempt to change the foundations of this contemporary moral theology. One of them takes an historical approach, Dom Odon Lotan, a Benedictine, who studies scholastic theology from the 12th to the 16th century. Rather than staying fixed in the manual's demarcated territory of the sinful action, Lotan produced 8 enormous volumes that thematically treat the scholastics' writings and their positions on the nature of moral agency, moral virtue, and moral theology. He aims to show that for the centuries before the manualist, the scholastics, think of Thomas Aquinas, urged Christians to avoid evil precisely so as to pursue the good. Moreover, as opposed to the manualists who highlighted the importance of a moral teaching being historically continuous, that is, as we would hear, as we have always taught, which is when I tell my students, check it out. Lotan found that the scholastic theologians were more interested in persons than in sinful actions, debate, and then universal agreement. Or they were more interested in historical development than in long-standing consistency. They wanted to see what was new, not what stayed the same. Later, Lotan applied these insights to his own contemporary moral theology and proposed in 2 works, the well-ordered moral agent, capable of growth not primarily by avoiding sins, but by pursuing the moral virtues. He's trying to bring the moral virtues as foundations and not sin to be the point of departure for this field. As opposed to the manualists, the scholastics situated moral theology within the broader context of theology itself. Lotan's work was subsequently complemented by the Jesuit Gérard Gilman, who proposed in his dissertation the primacy of charity, a spirituality-based ethics founded on charity, the virtue by which we are in union with God and called to love God, self, and neighbor. Gilman went from charity, the form of the virtues, to the virtuous life, providing a deeper and more dynamic understanding of the moral truth that the agent pursues. By establishing the primacy of charity, whereby moral subjects can discover within themselves their primary identity of being children of God, Gilman developed an anthropology that moved from the depths of the human person into expressions of virtuous dispositions and actions. Additionally, 2 very different scholars presented historical investigations of other portions of Roman Catholic moral tradition. The judge, John T. Noonan, Jr., studied the development of moral teaching on a variety of very specific topics. He did a book on abortion, he did a book on contraception, a book on divorce, a book on usury and money lending. And then Louis Verrecke wrote about moral theologians from the 15th and the late 16th century to highlight the enormously productive period known as casuistry that succeeded scholasticism and preceded the manualist. Together, these writers gave us penetrating studies of particular issues and their methods, but neither presented a comprehensive study of the influences that shaped the entire moral tradition. In 1987, however, the English Jesuit Jack Morney, The Making of Moral Theology, a study of Roman Catholic tradition, did just that. Before he gave the Darcy Lectures at Campion Hall in Oxford in 1981, no one ever attempted what Morney achieved, an investigation into the development of the so-called moral tradition. As Oliver O'Donovan astutely observed, we must not miss the importance of his turn to history as a mode of pursuing moral theology, in teaching us that our contemporary disagreements need to be understood in the light of the past that has pursued them. He is directing the community of moral theologians along a path that they badly need to explore. In 8 chapters, Mahony first named and examined 6 major forces that constituted the moral tradition. The first was auricular confession, the confessional, expressing your sins to a priest and the priest hears it, auricular confessions. The second was the legacy of Augustine. The third was the distinction between natural and supernatural. The fourth was magisterial authority, and then subjectivity, the fifth, and the language of law, the sixth. He then turned a contemporary read of the conversion of those influences by explaining the writings of Humanae Vitae, and closed with a glimpse of his own hope for the future. Though Mahony clearly allied himself with those who called to expand the shaping of moral theology, that of these people I mentioned earlier. Unlike them, unlike Lotin, Gilman, Noonan, and Verrek, Mahony turned to history for the sake of deconstructing it. He saw no use to history other than to avoid what they did. Mahony wanted effectively to find out what is or what was holding us back. For this reason, almost all the reviewers noted that from Mahony we learned not about the riches of the tradition, but rather the restraining elements. Recently deceased Philip Endine noted in his review that Mahony takes us back to free us from what can so easily be an unreflective bondage to our past and to our traditions. O'Donovan himself wrote, Mahony has given his indictment with lucidity and irony. It is, in fact, a book all about the bad influences that conspired to form moral theology. David Brown wrote, what one misses from this liberal Catholic is any sympathetic engagement from the past. Almost everyone recognized that he was basically saying, we don't need to look at history, we need to know how it has restrained us by its obsession, basically, with sin. The first 2 chapters of his book provide, I think, the foundations for his position. Starting with auricular confession, Mahony brilliantly opens his work. He writes, to begin a historical study of the making of moral theology with an examination of the influence of the confessional may appear to some an intriguing and to others an unattractive prospect. But however one regards it, there is no doubt that the development of the practice and the discipline of moral theology is to be found in the growth and spread of confession in the church. Mahony convincingly narrates from the patristic era through the penitentials and later confessional manuals into the moral manuals that the moral tradition has been fixated with sin, or what he calls spiritual pathology. By examining early councils, the penitential tariffs themselves, the imposition of the Easter duty, the Council of Trent, and subsequent moral textbooks or manuals, Mahony marshaled the evidence for his indictment of moral theology's obsession with sin. Whereas many moral theologians criticized the manualist era for its emphasis on sin, Mahony blasts the entire tradition that singularly focused on, quote, man in his moral vulnerability. Mahony writes, the pessimistic anthropology from which it started and which served inevitably to confirm and reinforce itself, particularly when the subject was pursued in growing isolation from the rest of theology and developed as a spiritual arm of the church's legal system, drove moral theology increasingly to concern itself almost exclusively with the darker and insubordinate side of human existence. He calls this miasma of sin not only distasteful, but profoundly disquieting. He argues that aside from the scholastics, the 12th to the 16th century, the Catholic moral tradition has never really been interested in the other half of the first principle of the natural law, that is, to do good. With singular concern for avoiding evil, the tradition has not looked to what it means to be a disciple of Christ and to be led by the Spirit. Rather, it has looked solely at the person who is spiritually sick and wounded, whose sins need to be confessed. Astutely, Mahony noted that because it remained for centuries with such an exclusive focus on sin, it could never, ironically, appreciate the actual nature of sin. Sin became subdued by the penitential, the confessional, and moral manuals. It was compartmentalized into discrete, manageable categories which profiled sin and individualistic terms. You could confess, I murdered someone. And by the way, actually, there were 3 murders. That could be a confession. You could actually just put down 3 murders in one confession. Just think of that, how we used to confess sins. You know, I lied about serious matter. I think it must have been about 18 times. How did we do this? How did we manage to take all the atrocities that we do and just itemize them into a one-sentence phrase of accountability? That is a naive notion of sin. That gives you an idea of a naive notion of sin. Theologians over centuries, he writes, domesticated and trivialized sin and did little to engender and foster a healthy respect for real sin. His second chapter, after he does this on confession, follows very much the lead of the first. Because his implicit aim was to liberate moral theology from bondage, he chose not to praise Augustine, but to break the hold of, quote, the troubled person of St. Augustine on moral theology. Mahony's target was not Augustine in general, but Augustine's moral teaching. He writes, it is there that the darkness and the somber pessimism are most in evidence, and it must be said at their most dogmatic and devastating. He examines Augustine's teachings on grace, specifically in the claim that that God does not command the impossible, and on sexual morality. For Augustine, Mahony writes, grace is almost exclusively isolated in the will of the human. Augustine leaves us the implicit presupposition that all that is needed in the face of moral dilemma and challenge is sufficient effort. Mahony's argument against Augustine here is twofold. First, Augustine reduces moral dilemma to no more than a challenge of the will, and thereby leaves the Christian with the belief that all challenges are surmountable. Mahony believes Augustine's claim lacks any sense of reality. Then Mahony critiques Augustine's view that sexuality was exercised either for children or for lust. For Mahony, Augustine grossly limits the range of sexuality and in many ways frames it according to his own introspective makeup, which is nowhere more in evidence than in his own view of women. Mahony writes, he could not for the life of him think of any reason why woman should be given to man than for the procreation of children, which he writes, as the soil is help for the seed. Mahony's argument is not solely with Augustine, but also with the way the tradition has uncritically embraced his influence. The narrow and at times dualistic world of Augustine becomes the foundation of much contemporary moral theology, leaving us with a legacy that inhibits a full and adequate ability to provide moral guidance. Indeed, the negative anthropological vision of Augustine accompanies a pathetic obsession with sin, and as Mahony notes while quoting The City of God, it is no wonder that for Augustine, our righteousness in this life consists in the forgiveness of sins rather than in the perfection of virtues. Mahony's work became the foundational text, the foundational historical text for the Reformers, and it gave us what we were lacking, an understanding and a critique of the moral tradition. Still, we need to know not only what from the tradition we should avoid, but as Lotan, Gilman, Noonan, and Verreck showed us, what we actually can retrieve. That is what I intended to accomplish with my new book, History of Catholic Theological Ethics. Mahony's The Making of Moral Theology came out in 1987, the year I finished my dissertation. In 2004, I was invited by the editors of the Oxford Handbook of Theological Ethics to contribute to a section entitled Books That Gave Shape to the Field. They chose 7 such works that shaped the field of the 20th century of moral theology, and only 2 were Catholic. The first was social encyclicals. All the social encyclicals, they got 1 chapter, and then Jack Mahony's book got the 2nd chapter. And I was invited to review that chapter, review his book. I concluded my assessment that because his writings were so critical, making animates us then to articulate another making. Here then, what I propose is not a refutation of Mahony's astonishing work, but rather a recognition of what the scholarly community has subsequently learned since 1981 when he first gave these lectures. That subsequent research teaches us that Lotan and Gilman were actually right, that before the moral manuals, the tradition of moral theology locates avoiding evil within the context of a much more important end, and that is to pursue the good. So I am basically dismissing the claim that Mahony makes that what happened in the last 4 centuries was actually the groundwork of all of moral theologies for the first 16 centuries. And I want to say that's not true. Not by the research that we now have that he may not have seen because he spoke before they wrote. So another history of Catholic theological ethics. Since Mahony delivered the Darcy Lectures in 1981, scholars like Peter Brown, Rodney Stark, Wayne Meeks, Hugh Connolly, Carolyn Walker Bynum, Elizabeth Stark, Brian Daly, and Geliadu Strumsa published works that influenced greatly my very different understanding of the history of Christian ethics. Today, I will focus my findings on early Christianity. They led me to my own eventual articulation of the overall hermeneutics for the early formation of moral theology through the concept of pathways of holiness instead of the confession of sin. Let me add here at the outset that time does not allow me to reply to Mahony's depiction of Augustine or anything later. Though I think that Augustine's writings on women and sexuality are indeed problematic, I argue in my book that Augustine has much more to offer us than these impediments. So first, one thing is we're all interested in the Irish penitentials. It was, in fact, a work on the Irish penitentials that first got me to recognize that the history of moral theology was not as damned by sin as Mahony claimed. For the longest time, we thought of the Irish penitentials as standalone texts that helped abbots and abbesses to ascertain fair penances for similar sins in the different abbeys. So what we found is these penitentials are these little booklets. They'd be about 10, 12 pages. And what they were a list of penances that you would have to offer to somebody if they confess a sin. And they were according to the 7 deadly sins, so lust and gluttony and avarice and pride, each of the sins are there. A lot on gluttony, a lot of drunken monks, basically. Because the only people who are confessing sins, we have to remember, are basically those who are in religious communities, priests, or very wealthy. They're the only people who are going to the Eucharist during this time, and they're the only ones who are interested in a personal practice of confessing sins. It's not, the church won't have a practice of confessing sins until about 1221, when we're told we have to have an Easter duty and that we have to receive communion at Easter time, and therefore we have to be in the state of grace to do that, and so we start going to confession. It takes about 100 years to get that up and going, but it's not until 1221 that, as a matter of fact, average lay people, would even think of confessing. And you have to remember then that nobody had heard their sins. Nobody had even thought of their sins. They only knew the sins that the monks and the nuns were confessing, so they had to make very big books to help them. But that's another thing you could read this book about. And so what we had were these little booklets, and we are going, look at these Irish, look, they're obsessed with sin. And they had this they would say, like, if you're drunk you're drunk during dinner, you have to do a week of fasting. If you're drunk during dinner and then go to Mass, you have to do 2 weeks. If you belch during Mass, you have to do 3 weeks. If you vomit, you have to do 4 weeks. If a mouse eats the vomit, you have to do 5 weeks. Now, that mouse eating the vomit is actually it appeared in one of the penitentials. They went into very specific things just to give advice, and they were basically written by an abbot who wanted to make sure that people were getting fair penances. In other words, everybody got the same penance for belching or vomiting or the rest. But you got a sense of what they were confessing. But that's all we knew about the penitentials with these texts. That's all we knew, was that they were lists of these texts, until Hugh Connolly investigated the practice. And in his study, The Irish Penitentials and Their Significance for the Sacrament of Penance Today, Connolly notes the originality of the Celtic practice of confessing sins in that it shows no familiarity with early canonical penances or any order of penitence. That is, they were not used as instruments for punishment and readmission to the sacraments. Instead, these confessions were usually made to a spiritual guide known as an anam cara, a Gaelic word which literally means a soul friend, who was recognized within the monastic system. An ancient Irish saying comments that anyone without a soul friend is like a body without a head. Every monk was expected to have an anam cara to whom he or she could make a manifestation of his conscience. Connolly's study remarkably shifted the understanding of the penitentials by demonstrating that the manuals were effectively aids for what today would be called spiritual directors, not confessors. That is, people who accompany others, not primarily in their avoidance of sin, but in their pursuit of promoting the kingdom of God. The role of the soul friend was not then a judicial one. Rather, the anam cara, in fact, there's a bar around here in Boston called the anam cara. So the next time you go there, confess your sins. Rather, the anam cara was a guide to accompany the individual through the trials of life. The encounter between the soul friend and the individual aimed at a dialogue that was, quote, neither contractual nor constraining, but which bore testimony instead to a God who was always willing to forgive. The dialogue was therefore, Connolly says, a healing one. For this reason, the anam cara was to be hospitable, welcoming the weary nun or monk on her or his journey. Thus, the anam cara is a fellow pilgrim on the same pilgrim path. The hospitality that the anam cara offered was solidarity, so that the pilgrim maintained the journey. In many ways, the anam cara was one who, quote, comes through the fire of real suffering and self-sacrifice, while at the same time growing ever more open to the saving, forgiving grace of Christ, and one who always reserves in his heart a sincere hospitality for the stranger, the fellow pilgrim, the fellow sufferer. Here we see sin in the context of responding in grace to the call to discipleship. In the attempt to follow, we sin. But in order to discern our way forward, we need to be accompanied. The penitential's tradition was established to better the pathway to holiness that the religious were pursuing. My second point, the rise of Christianity. In the mid-1990s, I also read another work which came from a recommendation from the Jesuit scripture scholar Dan Harrington, a work on the impact of the ministry of Christian mercy, accompaniment, and inclusion. So I team taught with Dan Harrington for about 15 years. We taught on scripture and ethics. It was a big hit, and teaching with Dan was a great deal of fun. I mean, it was really incredible. Some of you knew who Dan Harrington was, but he wrote 35,000 abstracts, reviews of articles or books. 35,000 he wrote. He was the best read biblical theologian alive ever. So team teaching with him was really great. He would do a biblical section, and then I would do an ethical section. And I would say, okay, what should I read of your bibliography here? And he'd say, oh, just read the first paragraph of that article, and read the last sentence of the second article, and read the title of the third. I mean, this was heaven, working with him. And every time he would tell me just exactly what to read, because he knew that's where the argument was, and don't bother anything else. He told me one day, read Rodney Stark's The Rise of Christianity. I said, what page does he say? The whole book. He never, ever made that comment on any other writing. Rodney Stark's The Rise of Christianity argued that Christianity was an urban movement and that the New Testament was set down by urbanites. But those urban areas were dreadful. Stark describes the conditions as social chaos and chronic urban misery. This was in part due to population density. At the end of the first century, Antioch's population was 150,000 people within the walls of the city, or 117 persons per acre. New York City has a density of 37 persons per acre, and Manhattan, with its high-rise apartments, has 100 persons per acre. In Antioch, it was 117 persons per acre. Contrary to earlier assumptions, Greco-Roman cities were not settled places whose inhabitants descended from previous generations. With high infant mortality and short life expectancy, these cities required, quote, a constant and substantial stream of newcomers in order to maintain their population levels. As a result, the cities were comprised of strangers. These strangers were well treated by Christians who, again, contrary to assumptions, were not all very poor. Through a variety of ways of caring for newcomers, financially secure Christians welcomed the newly arrived migrants. This welcoming, then, was a new form of incorporation. Stark notes, Christianity revitalized life in Greco-Roman cities by providing new norms and new kinds of social relationships, able to cope with many urgent urban problems. To cities filled with the homeless and impoverished, Christianity offered charity as well as hope. To cities filled with newcomers and strangers, Christianity offered an immediate basis for attachments. To cities filled with orphans and widows, Christianity provided a new and expanded sense of family. This new incorporation was distinctive. Certainly, ethical demands had been imposed by the gods of the Roman pagan religions, but their demands were substantially ritual, such as bringing food and other gifts to the gods. They were not, generally speaking, however, neighbor-directed. And while some pagan Romans knew generosity, that generosity did not stem from any divine command in their traditions, but rather simply from a particular person's own empathetic inclination. Unlike them, the Christians acknowledged that they were commanded to love their neighbor. They would acknowledge that they were not necessarily inclined to their neighbor, but they were commanded to love their neighbor. Thus, the newly arrived were interested not only in the Christians, but even more in the God of the Christians who gave such commands. Stark concluded, this was the moral climate in which Christianity taught that mercy is one of the primary virtues, that a merciful God requires humans to be merciful. However, the corollary that because God loves humanity, Christians may not please God unless they love one another was entirely new. Perhaps even more revolutionary was the principle that Christian love and charity must extend beyond the boundaries of family and tribe, that it must extend, quote, as 1 Corinthians says, to all those who in every place call on the name of our Lord Jesus Christ. This was revolutionary stuff. Indeed, it was the cultural basis for the revitalization of a Roman world groaning under a host of miseries. Third point, hospitality for the Christian family. Stark's claims were effectively developed by others. And through the eye of a needle, you remember the parable that, okay, good. At least there's some recognition. Peter Brown helped us to see, I always think that sometimes authors come up with a title that it's going to take people in the bookshelves another moment to say, I think that, yeah, okay. Peter Brown helped us to see that the practice of hospitality produced an appreciation for the poor as one's sibling. Brown turned to Ambrose to substantiate his claim, noting that Ambrose insisted that giving to the poor should be based on a strong sense of solidarity. Ambrose did not wish the poor to be seen only as charged outsiders sent by God to haunt the conscience of the rich. Brown writes, for this reason, Ambrose went out of his way to make sure Christians did not see almsgiving as a from on high gesture. Rather, they were encouraged to see it as a gracious repayment to their fellow humans of an ancient debt. Brown added, the intervention of a preacher such as Ambrose toward the end of the 4th century showed that the poor could no longer be spoken of as others, as beggars to whom Christians should reach out across the chasm that divided the rich from the poor. They were also brothers and sisters, members of the Christian community, who could also claim justice and protection. Thus, collections and hospitable practices were not only provided by the wealthy. As Paul instructs in 1 Corinthians, on the first day of each week, let each of you set something aside privately, storing up what each one can if he has prospered. So basically, this was not just the wealthy who were helping. It was a command for all people that Paul, in fact, is training the people of God to do. The practice of hospitality, as well as the raising of funds for the missionaries, were for those with any income. These practices then became institutionalized. Christians had collections, were prepared for the newly arrived, hosted them in the name of the bishop, and recognized them as siblings. Moreover, unlike others whose religious practices always were confined to sacred occasions and rituals, the Christian practices were ordinary, constant, and integral to their own self-identity. Wayne Meeks also wrote, and he argued similarly that these practices were highly communal, yet effectively institutionalized. He had a landmark work called The Origins of Christian Morality, the first 2 centuries. You see how I'm referring to all these works that come out after Mahony, and we're learning a lot more, and it's not what Mahony has translated the tradition to be. He made an extraordinarily broad claim about the aim of the New Testament and its relationship to moral truth. He says, almost without exception, the documents that eventually became the New Testament and most of the other surviving documents from the same period of Christian beginnings are concerned with the way converts to the movement ought to behave. They were training manuals for learning how to be a Christian. These documents were addressed not to individuals, but to communities. That growth is dependent on one insight, that the formation of a Christian moral order that would lead to the upbuilding of community. He added, whence we have to see ourselves as brothers and sisters and not standalone figures. He added a phrase that has been repeated by ethicists time and again: making morals means making community. Making morals means making community. That, he wants to say, is the lesson from the scriptures. This is an extraordinarily important claim. Our happiness depends on this upright communal behavior. If we are not ethical together, we are not able to connect as a people of God, nor will we be able to share and live the good news. A focus on mercy and hospitality, not sin obsession, is the trademark of early Christianity. Their moral lives were clearly at the service of others whom they identified as siblings. And I think nothing is more clear than this 4th point about how the church was interested in developing these communities. And this is called dominical observance, or why we have to go to Mass on Sunday. The Sunday obligation teaching. Why are we obliged to go to attend Mass on Sunday and avoid servile work? Avoid servile work. Those of you who are anywhere near my age know that. Those of you who are not anywhere near my age may never have heard servile work. But the rest of us all grew up wanting to know whether keeping an electric dishwasher was servile work or not. Nowhere is the interest in incorporating others into the community as siblings of the Lord more in evidence than by the struggles of the early church to help others to be able to worship with them. When we turn to the history of Sunday or Dominical observance, as it was known, we find the long-standing effort to include others into the solidarity of the Eucharistic celebration, in which the breaking of the bread is at once the means and the promise of a community becoming one. We need to recognize that the early church did not prescribe a day of rest or Sabbath. It had no interest in Sabbath in the first centuries. On the contrary, like the frequent instances with which Jesus broke the Sabbath ban on work, early Christians seem similarly to be a busy lot, not resting in any noticeable way on any Sabbath. Paul, for instance, often refers to his own rejection of laziness and his acceptance of work. The general tendency of early Christians was to work 7 days a week. In his foundational work on the development of Dominical observance, the Redemptorist Louis Verrecke noted that from the very beginning, the early church came together on the first day, not on Saturday, but on the first day of the week, to celebrate the supper of the Lord. They chose to worship on Sunday because it was the day that Christ rose from the dead. On that day, a new creation began, which Christians gathered for the supper of the Lord. Here they simply celebrated Eucharist on Sunday without any law, neither a law to rest nor a law to worship. Verrecke tells us in the first 3 centuries, there is no law banning work. Whatever exhortations are solely focused on Sunday and the celebration of the Eucharist. In 321, the Emperor Constantine prescribes Sunday as a day of rest and prohibits judges, professionals, and soldiers from doing work, public work. Still, he permitted personal as well as agricultural work. Later, at the end of the 4th century, apocryphal texts from Syria and Alexandria contain orders of that the Lord to give rest to slaves and to those oppressed by work, so that again, like Constantine's soldiers and civil servants, they too may participate in the Eucharist and receive religious instruction. So we see that by this time in the 4th century, after Constantine and now these other texts, that there seems to be an interest about those who can't get to the Eucharistic celebration. And maybe they don't have permission to come there. So Constantine, the emperor, says, soldiers do not have to be soldiers on Sunday. And he liberates them to attend Eucharist. He liberates them to attend Eucharist. And he forbids them to do soldiering work unless they're in a war. And then in the 4th century, these other texts are about slaves. And it seems to be that they're concerned that slaves cannot attend, and therefore slaves should have a day of rest. These are local events happening around that give us an indication of what early Christians are thinking. At the Council of Orleans in 538, the very first ban on Sunday work appears. So it's not until 538 that the first ban appears. It's a ban on any hard labor that would keep the masses from receiving religious instruction at the Eucharistic celebration. In effect, the poor, like the soldiers and slaves earlier, were freed to worship, and the weight of the law was borne by the masters of the poor, who had to release them from this labor. So the serfs, the poor, the soldiers, and the slaves loved this law. This law was a burden for the masters, not for these people. The law was to liberate them so that they could participate in the liturgy. Later, Martin of Braga, who dies in 580, used for the first time the term servile work. Why was servile work bad? Because it was the work of serfs. It wasn't for the work of the people in our households. We started using it analogously. But the word servile work was to say that serfs should not be working on Sunday. It's the first time that we see it used. Here again, the work ban is to lift their impediments, to let them go free for a moment to worship at the Eucharist. Finally, in 789, there's a ruling that with the exception of produce providers, soldiers in active war, and those burying their dead, no worker could labor on Sundays. The Dominical observance laws were designed to free those who had not the freedom to participate in the Eucharist. They are brought into Eucharist to receive the body of Christ and to receive the gospel and to enter into the community of believers and worshipers as siblings of Jesus Christ. Fifth, the centrality of mercy. In my book, A History of Catholic Theological Ethics, I often turn to the works of mercy, as they were developed in early Christian communities, the abbeys of the early Middle Ages, the guilds of the 13th century, and the confraternities of the 16th century. In the early church, the most interesting work of mercy, think, the 8 works of mercy, just think, what do you think in the early church is the one that most people actually focus in on, the most interesting work? The last, bury the dead. It's the one that's not in the list, too. Just think of that. I mean, the list of the works of mercy in Matthew 25 have 7, but now we have 8, and the 8th one is bury the dead. While belief in the resurrection is, as Augustine notes, what separates Christians from others, the Emperor Julian contended that one of the factors favoring the growth of Christianity was the great care that Christians took in burying the dead. Though individuals often performed the task, the church as a community assigned it to the deacons, and as Tertullian tells us, the expenses were assumed by the community. Lactantius reminds us further that not only did Christians bury the Christian dead, they buried all the abandoned who were dead. We will not therefore allow, Lactantius writes, we will not therefore allow the image and workmanship of God to lie as prey for beasts and birds, but we shall return it to the earth whence it sprang. The significance of burying the dead is rooted then in a profound respect that Christians have for the way we are related to one another through the human body. Where does that respect come from? The New Testament reveals not simply who we are in Christ, but who we will be. If our corporeality encompasses our existence and is the basis for our relationality, then the resurrection of our bodies means that in our bodies we will be one with one another in glory. That promise also leads to the hope that we will never be at war within our bodies again. In his study of the early church, Geraldo Strumsa announced that integrating the humanity and divinity of Christ was the major theological task and accomplishment of the early church. The early church knew that Christ was divine and that Christ was human. They just didn't know what to do with these two concepts until finally they embraced them and said, he is at once both. He writes, the unity of Christ, possessor of two natures, but remaining nonetheless one single persona, is, of course, in a nutshell, the main achievement of centuries of Christological and Trinitarian pugnacious investigations. To follow Christ meant that Christians were called to seek a unified self like Christ. As Christ brought divinity and humanity into one, Christians were called to bring body and soul together. Integration became a key task for all early Christians, as Strumsa notes, to be an entity of body and soul, a Christ-bearing exemplar. Small wonder why the virtues emerged then as the mode that early Christians taught one another what it meant to integrate. For the virtues teach us that through embodied practices, we integrate the person and the community into the people we wish to become. While a key Christian task, the integration of body and soul was not an aim for pagans. So Christians had this idea, but not the pagans. As Meeks and others note, the self in Greek thought was distinct from the body. For Plato, to know oneself, the reflexive attitude par excellence, meant to attend to one's soul at the exclusion of the body. Thus, when Christianity, on the belief that the human is in God's image, made integrating the body and soul a theological expression of humanity's integrity and a normative task, it proposed to the Western world a new claim of the human body. Strumsa writes, the discovery of the person as a unified composite of soul and body in late antiquity was indeed a Christian discovery. Peter Brown argued similarly. Though often understood as a flight from the body, the doctrine of sexuality as a privileged symptom of personal transformation was the most consequential rendering ever achieved in the ancient and Christian yearning for a single heart. Brown investigates how Christian doctrine freed Christian citizens from Roman control over their bodies. That control exercised itself in two ways. The human body of the nobility was to uphold the dignity of the state, through the citizen's own noble bearing, and the human body was to reproduce so as to give the state control over the chain of generative life. Thus, the Roman state was assured both of its pride and of the children it needed, in return gave to the citizens freedom to do whatever they wanted with their bodies, so long as they did it with proper discipline, or as John O'Malley would say, with style. In this exchange, the state invested the human body with a dignity derived from the state's needs and not from the body's own integrity. Christians and Jews resisted this exchange and charged that the city bestowed the human body with a false indeterminacy that in their eyes was created in God's image. Recouping that determinacy meant a rejection of the great deal of sexual liberties. But in doing so, the church liberated the human body from the city's control. Brown wrote, Christian attitudes to sexuality delivered the death blow to the ancient notion of the city as the arbiter of the body. Christian preachers endowed the body with intrinsic inalienable qualities. It was no longer a neutral, indeterminate outcrop of the natural world, whose use and very right to exist was subject to predominantly civic considerations of status and utility. Just think, Christians invented perpetual virginity. The way they invented it, and it's according to what Brown is saying here, the way they invented it was that many of the early churches are supported by wealthy women. Go to Luke 8, 1 through 3. Luke 8, 1 through 3. It will tell you that Jesus is traveling around, and then that there are these three women who are traveling with him who are supporting his mission journeys. This had enormous impact on many people because they saw that Jesus' ministry was funded by these three women and a few others. Later on in the early church, it was especially widows. There were two types of widows. There were poor widows who needed people to be merciful and to engage and support them and anticipate their needs and try to incorporate them into the community. But there were another group of widows who were wealthy and who decided not to get married again, and that they had control over their purse. And many of the churches, the early churches are house churches. Many of those house churches are supported by these wealthy widows. Their daughters want to exemplify their mothers. And they decide that they're not going to bother to get married and then wait for their husbands to die. Not that they were doing that, but that they thought that there's no need to do that. Why do I have to get married in the first place? And they invent, if you will, a practice, an action called perpetual virginity. Perpetual virginity becomes, if you will, a way that the church actually advanced considerably. I tell this in my class that I have right now over at the STM this semester, that if you go to Ravenna and you see the great mosaics in Ravenna, they have these great processional works of mosaics, and you'll see on one side all the martyrs going up to the high altar of Christ, carrying the instruments of their martyrdom. But on the right, you see all the virgins going up, and they're carrying baskets. They're carrying wealth. Virginity was not about sexuality. It was about financial independence and the ability to support and nurture and sustain and help grow the early church. The entire ministry of virginity was based by these women in their decisions that they made. Francine Codman, the late Francine Codman, did a fantastic article in Anglican Theology Review on the martyrdom of Tekla and other virgins, that when these women were martyred, they were martyred by the state for daring not to give to the state children. They used their bodies so that in their virginity they could be sources of strength to support the community. And their deaths were much more barbaric than any of the others, and they were much more sexually charged as well. She really wants to show us, and I say it at length in this new book, about how the state of virginity was actually a wild contradictory and a sign of hope of moving forward, and an inventiveness that came from below by these young women trying to emulate the ways that their mothers pursued. But here I must, because of time, stop. Much more could be said about women's agency in this task of integration, about their invention of perpetual virginity, about their hospitality in forming early churches. Similarly, we could consider how later the church removed human sexuality from the task of integration. That was a mistake. such that James Brundage notes, the Christian horror of sex has for centuries placed enormous strain on individual consciences and self-esteem in the Western world. I love this. It's a history of the church on sexual morality. And he writes, the Christian horror of sex has for centuries placed enormous strain on individual consciences and self-esteem in the Western world. Nonetheless, if you want to know more about these matters, you can find out this in this new wonderful book. But here I want to thank, as I conclude, this event that you've put together, you and Tara, and others in supporting me, and those who are online watching this. But I think it's important for us to realize what I argued from the beginning. The moral tradition developed from its inception pathways to holiness, embodied pathways that were collective, merciful, hospitable, inclusive, exemplary, and grace-filled. Yes, they confessed their sins, but they did so not as much out of fear of damnation, but out of an embodied love to become more like the one who they followed, who called them into the field of service. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Father Keenan. We now invite you to turn and talk to your neighbor. And if you're joining us online, we're going to open up the chat. Father Keenan has prepared a discussion question for us. So the question is, presuming that you were surprised that the moral tradition in the early church was really much more about innovative forms of discipleship than about avoiding or confessing sin, what were the two innovations that you were the most surprised about? And I'll read it again. Presuming that you were surprised that the moral tradition in the early church was really much more about innovative forms of discipleship than about avoiding or confessing sin, what were the two innovations that you were the most surprised about? So introduce yourself if you don't know the person sitting next to you, and we're going to chat for a couple minutes, and then Father Keenan is going to answer questions. Thank you.
So I'd like to hear what you find surprising. Hello. I'd like to hear what you found surprising, but also to hear your questions.
If you have a question or comment, just raise your hand and one of our graduate students will come over. Thank you.
Thanks, Father Jay. I really enjoyed your presentation. I think
You need to say who you are.
Oh, okay. I am Simon.
I know who he is. That's why I'm doing this. We're good friends.
I am Simon Mary Ayoka. I am a visiting fellow at the Jesuit Institute. I'm a professor at University of Portland, Oregon. I enjoyed your presentation. Thanks a lot. What I found most surprising was how we literally shifted this notion of virginity, which just blew my mind away, and that was one. And then also this idea of the split in the moral tradition, the consciousness. But that's that. But I have a question which I want to ask. As you were presenting, I started asking the following in my head, that could the Counter-Reformation of the church have something to do with the split in the moral consciousness and the development of the tradition and the forgetfulness of the richness of the tradition? Because the Counter-Reformation was literally trying to bring order to what it considered chaos. Yeah. Chaos in theology, chaos in sacramental practices, chaos in the sense of Christendom and so on. I don't know if your research went there.
I mean, no, my book does that. What it is in the 16th century, after the Council of Trent, the Council of Trent mandates seminaries. We need the training of priests. There was no training of priests before the Council of Trent. There were no seminaries, really. Some religious orders, like the Dominicans, had some training that happened in their ranks, but that's just the Dominicans. So it's not until then. It's then that the textbooks are developed. And at the same time, these moral manuals are developed. So the period of manualism develops as the Council of Trent mandates these new seminaries to be developed. But at the same token, at this time, they decide that moral theology should be about confessing sins. And so they'll even teach that the Ten Commandments should be taught for the confessor who sits in the tribunal of the confessional. That these are phrases that are right in the Council of Trent, in its teaching of the Catechism on the at that time. So sin emerges in the sixth. So that my argument, and I think many people will acknowledge that from the 16th century on, the moral life is avoid sin, and most of us will concede that. But suddenly, by the end of the 19th century, people are saying, "Is that all there is? Is that all there is?" And then, as the war starts approaching, as fascist and Nazi Germany, fascist Spain and Italy, Nazi Germany are developing, and all these right-wing movements like this are developing, and Catholics are joining them because they're following the leader. People like Lotan are very alarmed that we're not teaching about the conscience, that we're not understanding how important the conscience is so that people can think about that. And they see how complicit the Catholic Church is. So they're reformers in part because they see the actual effects of a type of people who are only animated to avoid evil instead of to pursue the good, to pursue discipleship. Oh.
Hi, Jim.
Steve.
My name is Steve Kruger. I'm the president of a social justice advocacy organization. Your presentation has broadened my view of the pathway to holiness, which I think is beautiful. My question is, what thoughts do you have about how we can get more Catholics and Christians to want to go onto the pathway of holiness?
Well, I think it's important for us to know that this is nothing new. I mean, I'm very interested in saying this is the gospel. How it was received in the early church was to be disciples of Jesus. And like I'm only giving you like about a third of the instances, just the works of mercy. They all visited prisoners. Why were they visiting prisoners? Jesus was a prisoner. Paul was a prisoner. Peter was a prisoner. Most times it was Christians who were in their prison. So they had a very active prison ministry. There's not just an active prison ministry that happens at our college campuses at the end of the 20th century or the beginning of the 21st century. This is what we started with, and that's just one work of mercy. All 8 works of mercy were compelling ways of living out the gospel. But so were the Beatitudes. So was the way that we celebrated Eucharist. So was the invention by the virgins of supporting the churches. There was so many different inventive ways that if we knew more about our tradition, if our clergy and our episcopacy knew more about our tradition so that they could promote it more, we would be in a much better place. That's why I think the reform of our hierarchy is really necessary in these times, because until we have a reform of the hierarchy, we're going to be stuck with the same old nonsense where we don't even know what's happening in Rome. So there has to be a way. That's why I did this book. I worked for 12 years on this book, and I worked it for an audience like you. I thought that, when I was growing up, there were a couple of books that I wanted on my shelf because I wanted to know about Catholicism through those books. I thought, I want to do that in moral theology. I want to do a readable text that people can use. It's readable, but, you got to be patient, Dominical observance is not something that you're going to be chatting on about. But still, I'm interested in you grasping what the tradition is. And I'm interested in promoting this, not for me, I could care less. I really believe that if we knew our tradition, and if we understood that our tradition was not this burdensome, I got to avoid sin, but God, look at these saints who went before me, that is something that could animate the church, and knowing that tradition is really important. When I was ordered to do a doctorate, just out of the blue, my provincial came to tell me one day that I had to do a doctorate. His assistant came to tell me I had to do a doctorate. I had been a Jesuit for 11 years, and I got a call, and it was the assistant to the provincial, and he said, "Hi, Jim." I said, "Who is this?" He said, "Al." I said, "Al who?" He said, "You're vice provincial." I said, "Oh." I said, "Why are you here?" He said, "I'm here to see you." I said, "Why are you here to see me?" I said, "None of the other New York Jesuits are here." It was up here at Weston. He said, I just came to see you alone. No Jesuit ever wants an unannounced visit of their superior to come. It usually means pack your bags. So I say, when should I meet you? He said, now would be fine. I said, okay, where are you? He said, across the street. So I go across the street, and I see him, and he says to me, how are your vows? I said, my vows? My vows are fine. He said, oh, that's good. So I thought, oh, well, what's going on here? And he said, I want you to know you're doing a dissertation. You're doing a doctorate. I said, I'm doing a doctorate. Really? He said, yeah. I said, I've been a Jesuit now for 11 years. I've never been asked, we've never discussed this. He said, we are today. I said, how? He said, yesterday the provincial council met and they decided you have to do a doctorate. And we thought you should be the first to know. And then, no, this gets more absurd. When you think of all the stuff that Anne-Marie, when you think of all this stuff about Jesuit discernment, about how Jesuit discernment works, this is the way it works in now ranks. What we tell you is one thing, what we do is another. And so I said, so what am I doing a doctorate in? He said, well, I've been told that to wait here for 24 hours, and at the end of 24 hours, you're going to tell me what you're doing your doctorate in. I said, all that accompaniment, walking with me on the passageway, or working out my life, no, you're doing a doctorate, and you're going to tell me tomorrow at this time what you're doing it in. And I said, oh, okay. I went home, and John O'Malley was in my community, Brian Daly, a whole mess of people. We were 12. And I said, I've been told that I had to do a doctorate. They said, it's about time. I said, what should I do a doctorate in? They said, moral theology. You're interested in moral theology. Just do moral theology. So I went to see him the next day, and I said, I'm doing it in moral theology. He said, where? I said, wait a second. Just give me a break. But I then went into the field. I went into the field because I had this nun, Mary Emil Panay, who kept telling us these stories of this man, Joseph Fuchs, who she studied with in Rome. And she would say, I didn't know what to do, so I would ask Fuchs. She became his assistant. But one of the things that I wanted to learn, and this was in 1982, the year I got ordained and the year I started doctoral studies, was that I thought that in the United States, the right wanted to lock up the tradition as this avoidance of evil. And they wanted to name every hard sin, especially sexual sins, that had to be avoided. And then the left had no interest in the tradition. And I wanted to learn the tradition. I believed, I had learned from O'Malley and Daly and others that the tradition was rich, but I didn't learn that in moral theology. I wanted to learn it from Fuchs. So I went to study with Fuchs because of this nun, Mary Emil Panay. And because I believed that the tradition really had something to offer. So the past 15 years, I've been teaching these courses so that I could do this book. So I could write in a comprehensive way to say, this is the way the tradition unfolds. And to also say that it's worth imitating and knowing. And I think that's the case. I'm very surprised that Megan said to me she likes when I go off script, but that gives you an idea of how much I'm interested in this issue. Others, yeah. Oh, sorry.
Hello. My name is Maura. This is actually my neighbor Bill's question, but I actually want to know the answer to. It's a good question, right? You mentioned that the New Testament was kind of like a training manual for converts of how to kind of be communal and neighborly to a really high, densely populated area. How are they kind of teaching these concepts and circulating them, since I imagine, a lot of people couldn't read maybe, or they weren't always written down?
Well, say that, I missed you in that last sentence. How do
they circulate these concepts and ideas and try to convert people if people weren't?
So all the teachings of the early church are basically sermons. And they're sermons of the so-called fathers. So it could be Gregory the First, it could be Ambrose, it could be Augustine, it could be Lactantius, it could be Tertullian, all these different sermons that are coming on. And most of the sermons are basically people unpacking Paul or the Gospels about how to follow Christ. They're talking about Christ, but they're also, as he says, and it's Wayne Meeks' argument, that all the New Testament is basically giving a code for how to become a Christian. Rodney Stark says the same thing. He says it wasn't simply the service that they provided. Stark is the one who says that Christians were to love their neighbor, and this was really changed the Roman Empire. But he also says they had a nice, easy kerygma that they could teach, that Christ came to save us from our sins and to teach us the way to the kingdom of God by his life, death, and resurrection. That was the kerygma in brief. And so they had good branding. They had good stories. They had parables that they repeated, the Good Samaritan, the prodigal son, forgiveness, reconciliation, building up the community, but also the works of mercy. We know the early church did two things. First, they started immediately worshiping on Sunday. They started celebrating the breaking of the bread and the drinking from the cup. That the disciples at Emmaus, that story is a good signal to us that the early church quickly appropriated the Eucharist. That's the first thing that they do. The second thing is they practice the works of mercy. They see that as a code, and they see that that's what they have to do. And they see that it has a lot more meaning than they thought. So there's a lot more. The parables themselves become instructive, but those two things are the points of departure.
Hi, thank you so much. You've got my Enneagram 3 head going through all my to-do list. My name is Sharon Dickinson. I'm the Director of Spiritual Care at Salem Hospital. And I have 3 things, and they're all way more practical than theological or historical. And by the way, I wasn't surprised. It felt very on track, everything you were saying.
Yeah.
But anyhow, 1, you talked about honoring those who have died. I've seen 2 patients at the hospital in as many weeks who are anticipating their own death for various reasons. They're not imminently dying, but they will die, and probably in the next year or 2 or 3. And they're saying, I don't have enough money. I don't have any savings. I'm impoverished. I'm homeless. Will the church bury me?
Yeah.
So that's 1. 2, we have a third of our beds are behavioral health beds. These are people who are in locked units. And the thing that goes with mental illness almost always is isolation. And you had this theme of community throughout. Meanwhile, I'm thinking, okay, how do we harness that? And and the third thing was restorative justice, that when people actually do go off track, how do we restore them without going straight for, judicial consequences?
Yeah. Okay. Very briefly, I have no idea. I do think that the first one about people who are anxious about their deaths and being ready for their deaths and the needing financial support to prepare for death. I think this gives us an idea of how the early church actually took care of that. The early church has a certain way of welcoming the early community. The confraternity, but it keeps repeating itself in different times. So the 16th century is the time of the confraternities. All these confraternities rise up. These are confraternities. They're run by lay people and priests together, usually 50-50. They had boards, and they would do it, and they would take care of all sorts. There was the Lazarus Society. They took care of people with leprosy. Lepers actually joined them, and then to become leaders in these leper places, as well as others who were in the ranks. But the confraternities did all sorts of really inventive things. I'm not going to go into a lot of them right now, but I do in my book because I love the confraternities. They show us, we think of lay leadership today as, look what we invented. Well, if we knew history, we'd say, look what we're bringing back. That's what's important. And what we're bringing back is that the confraternities were really bold. I mean, one of the biggest confraternities was to take care of people with syphilis in the beginning of the 16th century. That's not borderline work. That is borderline work. The imagination that people had. They built, for instance, 14 different major confraternities in Italy in the early 16th century, from 1507 to about 1530. And these buildings still stand today. On the south coast of the entry to the Grand Canal of Venice is a building this size of this building, Corcoran Center, this size, that is now a school for art, Belle Arti. But in the 16th century, it was the Confraternity of Divine Love. And it was to welcome all those who had syphilis who were entering the city of Venice, and they were kept quarantined in this place and cared for in a building this big. It gives you an idea, and the building is still standing. But in every Italian city, 14 of them, there are buildings of this size still standing 5 centuries later that give you witness to not only the scope of the work, but the investment, the financial investment that was made in order to do this, that these buildings are still standing 500 years later. So if we knew more about our tradition, we would realize that this is really a low point in our history. I mean, it's really low. I mean, if you know anything about the history, the past 4 centuries weren't that great with the manualists, but we have, most people think it still is about the avoidance of sin, but then they're fighting with one another. At least before, nobody was fighting with one another. Now we're all fighting, but we all think it's about sin. So we're probably really rock bottom right now. And it would be nice if we knew some of our history so that we could figure out a pathway to holiness for the future.
All right, thank you, Jim, and very impressive. My question is on the issue. Oh, my name is Henry. I'm a student at the STM. Thank you. So my question, I had to write it down just to be on point. So it's regarding the perpetual virginity you talked about. I get the impression that the profession of perpetual virginity in the early church was a commitment to discipleship by some women who used their resources in order to serve the church and the disciples of Jesus at the time. So my question is, were there no elements of physical, mortification or sacrifice or commitment or abstainment from any marriage or sexual relationship at all in such profession? And if so, then how did we develop to what we now know as perpetual virginity, where these women and men do not have any resources and yet they have a commitment?
Well, yeah. So as a matter of fact, remember, the first virgins were the daughters of these wealthy widows. It's important to know that this happened organically. It developed not as something that people just heard about. It's that they knew people who were already involved in this type of ministry. And then their daughters wanted to emulate them, and it spread that way. But then the narratives of these daughters actually became attractive. In the beginning, people were like scratching their heads, but they knew that their churches existed because of the widows. Now they realize they exist because of the daughters. And this is really, really rather significant. And, when you think of the Roman canon, it talks about virgins and martyrs. The notion of virginity was always about how our early churches were formed and sustained by this. They knew that some of these women were not able to do it easily, that it meant that they were not going to be marrying a rich man, that maybe they were going to disobey what their parents had actually said. These stories will unfold. One of the things that we know is that women then form societies among themselves, and that they're able to welcome women into their group. And they're going to, the whole notion of convent is a really fascinating thing to understand how women gathered collectively eventually. I remember when I started my network of Catholic theological ethics in the World Church, we started in Belgium, and we were living for a week in the Begijnhof. The Beguines there are all these movements that happen in history of women trying to find another option for living out their lives as Christians in the service of the church, but as collectors with other women. So that's a repetitive narrative in history.
Last question.
Yeah, good.
I've been trying to think of a tactful way to say this, and I'm not sure that I can, so please accept my ignorance. My name is Mark, and for years I've watched the church's response to sexuality, whether it be any one of the initials, or birth control, or marriage, or anything, and it seems the church's response seems amazingly negative and wrong. I don't understand that. I'm curious if you'd comment on it.
Yeah, so I have a little section in my book called An Odd Detour. And it's the church's teaching on sexuality. And my argument is that the church's teaching on sexuality has very little to do with the development of the moral tradition. And I insist that, as a matter of fact, it seems to be playing out. A horror or a fear or a way of trying to itemize and close down. So in this section, I talk about three developments. That first, we talked about sins that were against nature, and in most instances, these were sexual sins. When you think about it, when you think about lie, that should be against nature. When you think about pride, that should be against nature. But for the most part, the sins against nature, which were absolute sins, they were all sexual. Then the next category that the church develops is called intrinsic evil. This does not come from the 13th century with Aquinas. It actually comes from somebody who denounces Aquinas, another Dominican named Durandus of San Poisson. He develops this concept called intrinsic evil. This means these are actions that can never be performed for any reason whatsoever. And for the most part, these are sexual sins. And so that's that. And then finally, the last thing that comes up is poverty of matter. And this means that any action, any sinful action that is sinful in itself could never have any real little matter. Poverty means little or minor matter. This had to deal with fantasy. If you had a brief sexual fantasy, and some priest was to say that that was just a brief sexual fantasy, that would not be accepted. And the Jesuits actually became obsessed with this, such that if a Jesuit knew that another Jesuit held that there was poverty of matter about sexual sins, he should be denounced. And if you don't denounce it, you will be removed too. There's a dissertation that was done by a Jesuit, Patrick Boyle, on the poverty of matter. So in my book, for 10 pages, I say that there is one thing, and it's on sexual sins, that there's an absoluteness. There's, we're in a church that if you're divorced and remarried, you can't go to communion, but if you murder people, you can. I don't mean to be so simple, but that is true. There has to be a way that we have recognized that we've absolutized sexual sins to the extent that it's no longer credible, our teaching on sexuality. And so I write that in the book. I call it an odd Catholic detour, because it is a Catholic detour, and it's a very odd one. It's not the way we proceeded in everything else. When you look at the tradition, what we did with money lending, with war, with all sorts of issues, we took them very seriously. But our teachings on sexuality derived, for the most part, from men who were trying to have ascetical lives, and in their search for asceticism, wanted to have a purity that was marked by sexual abstinence. And their own personal struggles become, if you will, a template for our understanding sexuality. That's not helpful. And so this is what I outline in the text. So I do put sexuality, and I say the sexual sins are deeply problematic because of the way we absolutize them. There is poverty of matter, means that we say there are no venial sins. And they only taught this one thing. Only the sixth commandment has no poverty of matter. Only the sixth commandment has no poverty of matter. Think of that. That all the other commandments that you can violate had lightness of matter. Only the sixth. That teaching about poverty of matter gives us an idea of the obsession that we had in the church on the formation of the conscience and on formation of ministry. So the sexual sins, and the last thing is, I do believe that when one of the first articles I wrote was the Christian perspectives on the body. And as a matter of fact, on the body, we're really great. I got all this hate mail. Do you know how bad the church's teaching on sex has hurt my life? I have a horrible life because of the church's teaching on sex. I said, well, grow up, I get very impatient when people feeling crucified by the teachings. But besides telling them to grow up, I did want them to see that the church was talking about the body really without talking about sexuality. In the beginning, they are including sexuality, and the virgins are including it. People are keeping themselves, if you will, understanding the body. In fact, all the resurrection, all the creedal formulas was belief not in the resurrection of the dead, but the resurrection of the body. All the creedal formulas are belief in the resurrection of the body. The body was really considered important. As time went on, we excised sexuality from our Christian theology of the body. And it's really not until John Paul II that we have somebody who's talking positively about the body and talking positively about sex. That's a rant. Okay, so thank you.